Hello, I am Daisy, your hostess. Welcome to my channel. In this video, I will be flipping through the pages of the book titled The Stories of the Months and Days by Reginald C. Couzens. It may appear that the book may have not a thing to do with mysticism or self-development, yet. While I may not be an etymologist, I do have a fascination as to the origin of words and their meanings. I suppose inside of many of us, we want to know, where do we come from? Where does that come from? Where does the name of this come from? Maybe some of us are interested. Maybe we're curious. For the most part, you can ask anyone what is the origin of our calendar, and a good chance they will say its roots come from the Romans. Past that, not many of us know much more. Yet, what fascination it truly is that something as mundane as months and days are somehow a foundation that helps bring order to our lives, from birthdays to holidays. And soon, we will discover it is laced with juicy tales of gods, giants, nymphs, planets, and more. It begins to wake up an ancestry beyond fascination, or it may jolt us into questioning if the truth has been distorted, and for what aim. When we have sacred texts such as the Bible making reference to such possibilities. But then again, the Bible was put together by men, and we are flawed. In the Bible, in the book of Acts, chapter 19, verse 35, it's written in there, "And when the town clerk had appeased the people, he said, Ye men of Ephesus, what man is there that knoweth not how that the city of Ephesians is a worshipper of the great goddess Diana, and of the image which fell down from Jupiter?" The goddess Diana and Jupiter mentioned in the Bible? The image which fell down from Jupiter? I know this could be a metaphor. There is an article from Earth.com as well as an article from Natural History Museum, both under different titles, yet they were kind of getting at the same thing. And also, I have provided the links in the description of this video for your reference, so make sure to check them out. The article stated, the carbon, nitrogen, and oxygen atoms in the human body, as well as atoms of all other heavy elements, were created in previous generations of stars over 4.5 billion years ago. Professor Krasimpi from the University of Arizona explained that because humans and all animals contain these elements, we are literally made of star stuff. And then we jump into the talk of giants. And those are the Nephilims mentioned in the Bible, which might explain the giants of Greek mythology. According to the Hebrew Bible, they are described as mysterious beings or people being large and strong. I discovered that the word Nephilim in Hebrew literally means fallen ones, yet it's pretty clear that the Bible text is referring to size. That is, if you are not associating the passage to some metaphor and more as to an explanation of what someone was actually seeing. In the book of Numbers, chapter 13, verse 3, it is written, "And there we saw giants, the sons of Anak, which come of the giants, and we were in our own sight as grasshoppers, and so we were in their sight." And the Nephilims are also mentioned just before the flood account in the book of Genesis in chapter 6, verse 4, where they state, "The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God went in to the daughters of humans, who bore children to them. These were the heroes that were of old, warriors of renown." Well, there you have it. That's in the Bible. Seek and you shall find. maybe you don't want to seek because you might not like what you find. So just saying, it is written in the good book. There's no conspiracy theory there. I mean, how much clearer is that? The sons of God, and so there's a distinction there. The sons of God went into the daughters of humans. And then they went on to say these were the heroes that were of old, warriors of renown. Could that have been all those Greek heroes and Roman heroes? Well, now, let me tell you, if you want to go down a rabbit hole after you spend time here with me, I invite you to go look at some of the interviews of a gentleman named Anatoly Fomenko. He is a mathematician, topologist, and a member of the Russian Academy of Sciences. He claims that he has discovered that many historical events do not correspond mathematically with dates on which they're supposed to have occurred. And he also states that all of ancient history, including the history of Greece, Rome, and Egypt, are just a reflection of events that occurred in the Middle Ages, and that a lot of the history of the 17th and 18th century have just been fabrications. From what I'm gathering, it appears to me that the science community has pigeonholed his findings as pseudoscience. Now, I did say rabbit hole, right? So before you think anything might take you into the twilight zone, let's remember the Italian astronomer, physicist, and scientist Galileo Galilei from 1564 to 1642. He observed by telescope that the planets were round, and published in his pamphlet that was back known, The Letters on Sunspots, in 1612, a finding that was still considered new and controversial at the time, despite the previous circumnavigation of our globe by Magellan. Galileo also hypothesized that the Earth rotated around the Sun, which is the heliocentric model, a view that went beyond controversy, but was considered blasphemy by the Roman Catholic Church as it contradicted the Holy Scriptures. Galileo was tried by the Roman Inquisition in 1615, convicted of heresy, and was forced to recant his views and placed under house arrest for the remainder of his life. Fortunately for Anatoly Fomenko, I don't think he has to worry about that type of fate. Well, I hope he doesn't. Well, now that I've set the stage, sit back as we turn the page. The Stories of the Months and Days by Reginald C. Couzens. This book is in the public domain. Introduction. Our divisions of time. How familiar to us are the names of the months and the days of the week, and yet, how few of us know to whom we owe these names or what a wealth of meaning they possess. They have come to us from the past, from the time when people worshipped many gods and explained the wonders of nature in their own simple way. But before listening to the stories which these names can tell us, we ought first of all to remind ourselves of the way in which our divisions of time came into being. We all know that the earth turns round on its own axis, giving us periods of light and darkness, which we call day and night. The word day, which comes from a very, very old word meaning to shine, really means, of course, the time during which the earth is lit up by the sun, but it also come to mean the time which the earth takes to revolve, as from sunrise to sunrise, sunset to sunset, midday to midday. The Greeks measured the day from sunset to sunset, the Romans from midnight to midnight, the Babylonians from sunrise to sunrise. The day, in this sense, became the first measurement of time. The day, however, is a very short period, so another measurement was taken for a longer space of time, and this measurement was suggested by the changes in the moon. it was noticed that the moon altered in shape, beginning with the new moon, waxing to the full moon, and then gradually waning. So the space of time from one new moon to the next, about 29.5 days, was called a month or month, afterwards known as the lunar month. Lunar from Latin, luna, means moon. The next measurement of time, the year, was suggested by the seasons. People noticed that there was a period of heat and a period of cold, a time when the trees and plants put forth their buds, and a time when all nature seemed to die. And these periods became known as seasons: spring, the time when the plants spring up; summer, the mild or gentle season; autumn, the season of increase when the fruits of the earth are gathered in; winter, the windy or cold season. It was found that the time from one spring to the next, or from one winter to the next, was about 12 lunar months, and these 12 months were known as a year. The change of season is, of course, due to the movement of the earth around the sun, and the exact time taken by the earth is 365 days, 5 hours, 49 minutes. Now, a year of 12 lunar months is only 354 days. And the result of this difference was that the months got ahead of the seasons. And in a year or two, when according to the calendar, the spring months had come, it was really still winter. In order to put this right, the lunar year, a moon year, was made longer by having an extra month put in every now and then. In this way, the lunar year was made to correspond more nearly to the solar year, sun year, that is, the year of 365.25 days. The Jews put in a month 7 times in every 19 years, and the Greeks a month 3 times in every 8 years. The Romans had first of all a year of only 10 months, beginning with March. Then they added 2 months, making a year of 355 days. But even now, the number of days was short, and to make up for the loss, days were added from time to time. These extra days, however, were added in such a way that they led to great confusion, and the Roman dictator, Julius Caesar, in order to do away with this confusion, decreed that the year 46 BC should consist of 445 days, and fixed the length of future years at 365 days. But since the Earth's journey takes 365 days, 5 hours, 49 minutes, a quarter of a day was still lost each year, so Caesar ordered an extra day to be put on to February every 4th year, making that year what we call leap year, because the calendar makes a leap of 1 day. This new calendar is called the Julian calendar, after Julius Caesar. The lunar year, that is, the year of 12 months, seemed at last to be of the right length, but even now there was a very tiny mistake. You will have noticed that 5 hours, 49 minutes was taken as a quarter of a day, but it is short of 6 hours by 11 minutes. A very small difference, you will say. But after several hundred years, it amounted to 10 days, so that the lunar year was now too long. In 1582, Pope Gregory ordered that 10 days should be left out in that year, and the day after the 4th of October was called the 15th. The change was not made in England until 1751, when 11 days were dropped, and it led to a great deal of discontent among uneducated people, who thought that these days had been stolen from them. In order to prevent the mistake occurring again, it was arranged that instead of every 4th year being a leap year, the years which end in 00 as 1700, 1800, 1900 should not be leap years. Chapter 1. January, the month of Janus. The first month was called Januarius by the Romans, after Janus, the god of doors and gates. We see the same word in Janua, the Latin for a gate or opening. From the idea that a door is a way in, an entrance, it became a custom among the Romans to pray to Janus whenever they undertook a new work. He was also the god of the beginning of the day, and it was only natural that when a new month was added at the beginning of the year, it should be named after him. During this month, offerings to the god were made of meal, frankincense, and wine, each of which had to be quite new. Since the gate opens both ways, Janus was thought to be able to see back into the past and forward into the future, and he was usually represented in pictures as having a double head that looked both ways. On the earliest Roman coins, he is drawn with two bearded faces, with a staff in one hand and a key in the other. He was also the protector of trade and shipping, and on some coins, his head is shown with the prow of a ship. When people wished to picture him as the god of the year, they drew him holding the number 300 in one hand and 65 in the other. Janus was worshipped on the Janiculum, Hill of Janus, one of the 7 hills in which Rome was built. Since he was the god of gates, all the gates of Rome were under his care, especially the archway through which the army marched to war and which it returned. This archway was afterwards replaced by a temple which was called Janus Quadriformes, that is, 4-sided because it was square. On each side of the building there were 3 windows and 1 door, making 12 windows and 4 doors, which represented the 12 months and the 4 seasons. In times of war, the temple gates were kept wide open since people were continually making offerings to the god. But whenever there came a time of peace, the gates were at once closed. As we know the Romans were continually fighting, it does not surprise us to find that the gates of the temple were closed only 3 times in 700 years. Janus was said to be the son of Apollo, the god of the sun, whose daily task it was to drive across the sky in his chariot of fire. Each morning when Aurora, the goddess of the dawn, had opened the gates of the east, Apollo set forth, and when, his task accomplished, he reached the western ocean, he returned to his palace in the east. A quote by Milton, Comus. In the gilded car of day, his glowing axle doth allay in the deep Atlantic steam, and the slope sun his upward beam shoots against the dusky pole, pacing toward the other goal of his chamber in the east. End quote. Apollo had another son, named Phaeton, who one day persuaded his father to allow him to drive the sun chariot. All went well for a time, and then Phaeton, being a reckless boy, began to drive too fast. He soon lost control of the horses, which plunged madly along the bore of the chariot far from its track. It went so close to the earth that the fields were scorched, the rivers were dried up, and even the people were turned black, and they are black to this day. The cries of the terrified people attracted the attention of Jupiter, the king of the gods, who became enraged when he caught sight of the daring boy in the chariot of the sun. Taking up one of his thunderbolts, he hurled it at Phaeton, who, scorched by its fire, fell headlong to the earth. Another sad story told of Apollo is that of his friendship with a youth named Hyacinth. To talk with him, Apollo used often to come down to the earth. Zephyrus, the god of the south wind, was very fond of Hyacinth too. And one day, as Apollo and Hyacinth were playing a game of quoits, Zephyrus came by. Filled with jealousy at the sight of Apollo and his friend, he blew Apollo's quoit aside so that it struck Hyacinth and killed him. Apollo was greatly distressed at his friend's death, and in order that he might never be forgotten, changed the fallen blood drops into clusters of flowers, which we still call hyacinths. A quote by Milton. For so Apollo, with unweeting hand, whilom did slay his dearly loved mate, young Hyacinth born on Eurotas' strand, young Hyacinth, the pride of Spartan land, but then transformed him to a purple flower. End quote. Another flower which should always remind us of Apollo is the sunflower. A story says that there once lived a girl named Clytie, and that each day, with eyes full of love for the fair sun god, she watched him journey across the sky. But Apollo, knowing nothing of her love, took no heed of her as he passed. Clytie watched for him day after day on a river bank, and her heart sank as each evening she saw his chariot dip down into the west. She would not leave the river bank, but stayed all through the cold night, anxiously waiting for the first flash of the sun's rays from the glowing east. At last the gods took pity on her and changed her into a sunflower. Her green dress became green leaves, and her golden hair became yellow petals. Now was she happy indeed, for she knew that she could always see Apollo, and you will find that to this day the sunflower turns its head towards the sun as it moves across the sky. Aurora, the goddess of the dawn, whom we have mentioned as opening the gates of the east for the sun god Apollo, married a mortal, Tithonus, a prince of Troy. In order that their happiness might know no end, Aurora begged Jupiter to grant Tithonus immortality. The wish was granted, but in her anxiety that Tithonus should never be taken from her by death, Aurora forgot to ask also for the gift of eternal youth. As the years went on, Tithonus grew old and weak and became only a burden to her. At length, tired of his shrill voice and constant complaints, she turned him into a grasshopper, whose shrill complaining note is known to all. The name for this month among the Angles and Saxons was Wolfmonath, Wolf Month, since it was the time of year when the wolves were unable to find food, and their hunger made them bold enough to come into the villages. Chapter 2. February, the month of purification. This month did not always hold its present position, but was originally the last month in the year. The name is taken from a Latin word, februare, meaning to make pure. In the Palatine Hill, another of the 7 hills of Rome, was a cave dug in the rock, and in it stood an image of the god Lupercus covered with a goat's skin. Lupercus was the god of fertility, or springing into life, and on the 15th of February, a great festival was held in his honor. Sacrifices of goats and dogs were made. Then the priests cut up the skins of the goats, twisted the pieces into thongs, and ran through the city, striking all who came in their way. As in the very earliest times, it was the shepherds who held this festival. It is thought that this running about with thongs meant the purifying of the land. The idea of the whole festival seems to have been one of purifying, of a new life. So the name chosen for the month in which it was held was one formed from a word meaning to make pure. There are some who think that Lupercus was the same as Pan, the god of the shepherds. Pan was said to have been a son of Mercury, but he was not like the other gods. His body was covered with goat's hair, and his feet and ears were also like those of a goat. He was very fond of music and dancing, and spent most of his time in the forests playing with the wood nymphs, beautiful girls who lived among the trees. One day, he saw a wood nymph named Syrinx, with whom he fell in love, but she was frightened and ran away from him, and when Pan pursued her, she prayed to the gods for help. She was at once changed into a clump of reeds, and Pan, in his disappointment, broke off 7 pieces of the reed, bound them together, and so made an instrument of music, which was called the syrinx after the beautiful wood nymph. The invention of the syrinx by Pan has been wonderfully described by Elizabeth Barrett Browning in a poem which begins, quote, "What was he doing, the great god Pan? Down in the reeds by the river, spreading ruin and scattering ban, splashing and paddling with hoofs of a goat and breaking the golden lilies afloat with the dragonfly on the river." End quote. This story of Pan and Syrinx reminds us that the Greeks and the Romans imagined the mountains, the valleys, the woods, and the rivers to be peopled with lesser gods and goddesses whose task of caring for the trees, the flowers, and the grass was appointed them by Jupiter. The woodland gods were known as satyrs, and, like their leader Pan, were half man and half goat. Another famous satyr was Silenus, who was put in charge of Bacchus, one of Jupiter's sons, and the god of wine. Silenus taught Bacchus and accompanied him on his travels on the earth. The god of wine rode in a chariot drawn by wild beasts, Silenus following him on an ass, and with them a merry company of nymphs and satyrs crowned with ivy leaves, who danced and sang and made music in praise of Bacchus. Quote by Keats Endymion. And as I sat over the light blue hills, there came a noise of revelers. The rills into the wide stream came of purple hue. 'Twas Bacchus and his crew. The earnest trumpet spake, and silver thrills from kissing cymbals made a merry din. 'Twas Bacchus and his kin. Within his car, aloft young Bacchus stood, trifling his ivy dart in dancing mood, with sidelong laughing. End quote. Many stories are told of the wood nymphs, as the goddess of the woods are called. One of the most famous is that of the nymph Echo, who fell deeply in love with the beautiful Narcissus, whom she met hunting in the forest. Narcissus, however, took but little notice of her, and Echo's love soon turned to hatred and anger. She prayed to Venus, the goddess of love, that Narcissus might be punished for his hard-heartedness, and then, sorrowfully hiding herself among the mountains, pined away until only her voice remained, and in lonely places the voice of Echo still answers those who call. Meanwhile, Venus sought an opportunity for punishing Narcissus by making him suffer in the same way as Echo had done. One day, Narcissus, hot and thirsty with hunting, came to a shaded pool, and as he stooped to drink, saw in the clear water the face, as he thought, of a water nymph. So beautiful was she that Narcissus was filled with love for her, and eagerly stretched out his arms. But no sooner did his hands touch the water than she vanished. He drew back in surprise and waited anxiously till the ruffled water became smooth. When again he saw the beautiful nymph, he spoke to her, and her lips answered him, though he heard no sound. He slowly put out his hands towards her, and her hands came to meet his. Sure now of her love, he tried a second time to clasp her in his arms, but as before she vanished. Again and again he strove to seize the nymph, but each time she escaped his grasp. Amazed, Narcissus sank down by the pool and gazed upon that lovely face, which seemed to mock him, and yet held him there. Apollo and his chariot sank into the western sea, but the goddess of the moon shone on the water and showed the nymph still answering his words and holding out her arms to him. The days passed, and Narcissus, unable to tear himself away, grew pale and weak, watching the face, which also grew pale with despairing love. Thus was Echo avenged, for Narcissus slowly starved himself to death through love for his own image. The gods, however, took pity on him and changed his body into a cluster of flowers, which have ever since borne his name. We have associated Pan, the god of shepherds, with this month, and his name is found in a very similar word in our language. He took a great delight in frightening travelers by creeping up behind them in the dark, and the fear with which he filled them was called panic. It is interesting to note that just as the Romans held a ceremony of purification during the month of February, so the Christian Church holds the feast of the purification of the Virgin Mary on the second day of the month. The feast is called by Roman Catholics Candlemas, because it is the custom to have a procession in which candles are carried, and it is on this occasion that the candles to be used in the church during the year are consecrated. The weather at Candlemas is said to show what the weather will be like during the year, and an old proverb says, quote, "If Candlemas is fair and clear, there'll be 2 winters in the year." End quote. The Old English name for February was sprout kale. Since the cabbage begins to sprout at this time of the year, it was later changed to Solmonoth, sun month, because it is the time when the sun rises higher in the sky and begins to drive away the chill of winter with its glowing rays. End of chapter. Chapter 3. March, the month of Mars. This month, originally the first in the year, is named after Mars, the god of war. He was the son of Jupiter and Juno, the king and queen of the gods, and was generally represented in a shining suit of armor, with a plumed helmet on his head, a spear in one hand and a shield in the other. His chariot was driven by the goddess of war, Bellona, who also watched over his safety in battle. For the gods often took part in the battles which were constantly raging on the earth. During the great fight between the gods and the giants to decide who was to rule the world, Mars was captured by two of the giants, who bound him with iron chains and kept watch over him day and night. After over a year of captivity, he was freed by the clever god Mercury, who succeeded in loosening the chains so silently that the giants heard no sound. Mars also took part in the Trojan War, when he was actually wounded. Mars was loved by Venus, the goddess of beauty, but wishing to keep their love a secret from the other gods, they met only during the night, and Mars appointed his servant Electron to keep watch and to call him before the sun rose. And he did not wish Apollo, the sun god, to see them. One night, Electron fell asleep, and so was too late to warn Mars of the sun's approach. Apollo saw them from his chariot as he drove across the sky and told Vulcan, the god of fire, who caught them in a net of steel and thus held them prisoner, while the other gods made fun of them. As soon as he was set free, Mars, who was filled with anger against Electron for failing his duty, changed him into a cock, and driving him into a farmyard, condemned him to give warning every day of the sun's rising. A fanciful explanation why. Quote, "The cock with lively din scatters the rear of darkness thin," end quote, by Milton L'Allegro. The gods, though they themselves were immortal, that is, could never die, nor even grow old, yet sometimes married mortals, the men or women whom they found on the earth, and Mars fell in love with a beautiful girl named Ilia, who had given up her life to serve in the temple of Vesta, the goddess of fire. It was the duty of these priestesses of Vesta to guard the fire which continually burned on the altar of the goddess, for the safety of the people was thought to depend on this sacred flame. No Vestal, as these priestesses were called, was allowed to marry under penalty of death. Ilia, however, in spite of her solemn promise, consented to marry Mars, and keeping her marriage a secret, continued to live in the temple. In course of time, she had two sons, Romulus and Remus. Her father and mother, hearing that she had broken her vow, ordered the full punishment of her crime to be carried out. The mother was buried alive, and the children were left in the forest to be killed by the wild beasts. Thus Ilia perished, but the children were wonderfully saved, so the story tells us, by a wolf, who cared for them as if they had been her own young. They were soon after found by a shepherd who took them to his home, where they grew up to be strong and brave men. As soon as they had reached manhood, they left their home and went out into the world to seek their fortune. Coming to a beautiful country of hills and valleys, they decided to build a great city. But before they had even finished the outer walls, they quarreled about the name which was to be given to it when it was built. Romulus lost his temper and struck his brother Remus, so that he fell dead to the ground. With the help of a band of wicked and cruel men like himself, Romulus at last succeeded in building a city which, called Rome, after its founder's name, was to become one of the most famous cities the world has ever known. Romulus became the first king of Rome, but he ruled so harshly that the senators, the chief men of the city, determined to rid themselves of him. During an eclipse of the sun, which darkened the city just at the time when Romulus and the senators were assembled in the marketplace, the senators fell on the king with their swords and slew him. They then cut his body into small pieces, which they hid beneath their cloaks. When the light returned and the people found that their king had disappeared, the senators told them that Romulus had been carried off by the gods to Mount Olympus and ordered a temple to be built in his honor on one of the 7 hills of Rome. Mars took the city of Rome under his special protection and is said to have sent a shield from heaven during a time of plague as a sign that he would always watch over the city. The Romans, afraid lest the shield should be stolen, had 11 other shields made, so like the first, that only the priests who guarded them in the temple of Mars could tell which was the one sent from heaven. These priests were called Sali, the leapers, because they danced war dances when, during the month of March, the shields were carried in a procession through the streets of Rome. To Mars, as the god of war, the Romans naturally turned for help in wartime, and a Roman general, before setting out, went into the temple of Mars, and, touching the sacred shield with the point of his spear, cried, "Mars, watch over us." The training ground of the Roman soldiers was called Campus Martius, the field of Mars, in honor of the god of war, and it was commonly believed that Mars himself led their army into battle and helped to give them the victory. March was named after Mars because of its rough and boisterous weather, and we find the same idea in the minds of the Angles and Saxons, who called it Hilthmanoth, the loud or stormy month. Another name for it was Lectenmanoth, the lengthening month, because it is during March that the days rapidly become longer. End of chapter. Chapter 4. April, the month of Venus. This month of April has only 30 days, which is the number said to have been given to it by Romulus. The king who came after him gave it only 29, but Caesar, when he altered the calendar, gave it 30 again. The name April comes from the Latin word aprire, which means to open. And the month was no doubt so named because it is during April that the earth, which has been bound by the sharp frosts of winter, once again opens beneath the warm rays of the sun. The withered sheaths fall away from the ripened buds, which, opening out, disclose to our eyes their long-hidden treasures of beautiful color. We find that the month was sacred to Venus, the Roman goddess of beauty, and some people think for this reason that the name April comes not from Aperire, but from Aphrilis, which in turn comes from Aphrodite, the name given to the goddess of beauty by the Greeks. Venus is said to have sprung from the foam of the sea and to have made her way to Mount Olympus, the home of the gods, where, because of her wonderful beauty and grace, she was welcomed as the goddess of love and beauty. All the gods fell in love with her, but she scorned them all, and Jupiter, to punish her for her pride, ordered her to marry Vulcan, the god of fire. He was deformed and very rough in his manner. He had been thrown from the top of Mount Olympus by Jupiter in a fit of anger. Had he not been a god, he would, of course, have been killed by the fall, but he escaped with a broken leg, which made him lame for the rest of his life. He now lived on the earth and spent his time at the forge, making many wonderful and useful things from the metals which he found buried in the mountains. He built gorgeous palaces of gold for the gods, which he decorated with precious stones, forged the terrible thunderbolts used by Jupiter, and also made the arrows used by Venus's son, Cupid. Vulcan was naturally worshipped by all blacksmiths and workers in metal, and a great festival called the Vulcanalia was held in his honor. Cupid, whom we have just mentioned, was the god of love. He never grew up, but remained a little chubby boy with beautiful wings. He always carried a bow, and with his arrows pierced the hearts of young men and maidens in order to make them fall in love with one another. Another son of Venus was Aeneas, the great hero who was supposed to have been the founder of the Roman race. He escaped from Troy when at the end of 10 years' siege it fell into the hands of the Greeks, and after many adventures reached a part of Italy called Latium, where in later times his descendants Romulus and Remus founded the city of Rome. The story of Aeneas has been wonderfully told by the Roman poet Virgil in his great work called the Aeneid. In this book, Virgil wishes to show that Augustus, the emperor of his time, being a descendant of Aeneas, was also descended from the gods, since Aeneas was said to be the son of Venus. Part of the story of Troy, or Ilium, is told in the Iliad of Homer, the great Greek poet. We read there of the fierce struggles which took place before the walls of the city, of deeds of strength and valor, and particularly of the final combat between the great heroes Hector the Trojan and Achilles the Greek. in which the Trojan was killed. In spite of many successes in the field, the Greeks were unable to gain any entry into the city, nor were the Trojans able to drive the Greeks from the shore, and it seemed as if neither side would ever secure the victory. At last, Ulysses, a Greek prince who was renowned for his cunning, formed a plan for entering the city and thus finally bringing to an end the war that had lasted for 10 years. The Greeks built a wooden horse of such size that a number of men could be hidden within its hollow sides. This horse, filled with fighting men, led by Ulysses, was left on the shore, while the army embarked in their ships and sailed away as if tired of the endless struggle. The Greeks also left behind a cunning slave named Sinon, who was to play an important part in the plot. The Trojans, overjoyed at the departure of the Greeks, flocked down to the shore and crowded around the enormous wooden horse, full of wonderment at its strangeness. Many wished to drag it into the city at once, while some were filled with suspicion and urged their companions to distrust anything made by their enemies. Sinon, when questioned by the Trojans, pretended that he had been ill-treated by the Greeks and spoke with hatred and anger against them. He explained that the horse was an offering to the sea god Neptune, whose help the Greeks would need on their journey home, and he advised the Trojans to seize it and take it into the city. In spite even of those who suggested that armed men might be hidden in the horse, the Trojans dragged it into the city with great triumph, pulling down part of the wall to admit it, since it was too large to go through the gates. Then followed a night of feast and revelry. The Trojans, in their excitement, laid aside their armor and their weapons and gave themselves up to wild merrymaking. The smoky flare of the torches lit up a scene of mad delight. Suddenly, shouts of alarm arose on every side, followed by the clash of weapons. Armed men poured in on the astonished Trojans, and in a short time Troy was in the hands of the Greeks. Under cover of the darkness and the noise, Ulysses and his companions had crept from their hiding place, had overpowered the careless sentries, and opened the gates for the Greek army, whose ships had returned in the night. Thus, through the help of the clever Ulysses, the Greeks overcame the army that had so often beaten them in the field, and by a trick brought to a victorious end the great Trojan War, for which the goddess Venus had been responsible, as we shall read in a later chapter. The Old English name for the month of April was Ostermonath, or Easter Monath, because it was the month sacred to Easter, or Ostara, the goddess of spring. The same name is still kept by the Germans, who call it Ostermonath. The time of year known as Easter is named after this goddess, and though Easter is now a Christian festival, it was in the first place a feast held by Saxons in honor of their goddess Easter. It was the custom for the people to give one another presents of colored eggs, because the egg is supposed to represent the beginning of life. And the feast was held in the springtime, when nature wakes to a new month from the death of winter. The custom, which we still have, of sending Easter eggs to our friends is therefore a very, very old one indeed. End of chapter. Chapter 5. May, the month of Maia. This month is named after the goddess Maia, to whom the Romans sacrificed on the first day of the month. Maia was one of the Pleiades, the 7 daughters of Atlas and Pleione. They were all transformed into pigeons that they might escape from the great hunter Orion, and flying up into the sky were changed into 7 stars, which form the constellation known as the Pleiades. On any clear night, you may see these stars clustered closely together, but they are not very bright, one of them being very faint indeed. A story says that at first they shone brightly, but after the capture of Troy by the Greeks, they grew pale with sorrow. Another story says that all but one were married to gods, and that when they became stars, the one who had married a mortal did not shine so brightly as her sisters. Maia was the goddess of the plains and mother of Mercury, the messenger of the gods. In order that he might perform his duties as messenger more swiftly, Mercury was given by Jupiter wings for his feet and a winged cap for his head. He is said to have invented the lyre or harp, and to have given it to the sun god Apollo, who gave him in return a magic wand called caduceus, which had the power of making enemies become friends. Mercury, in order to test its power, put it between two fighting snakes, and they at once wound themselves around it. Mercury ordered them to stay on the wand, and in statues and pictures the god is nearly always holding in his hand this wand with the snakes twisted around it. Mercury was not only the messenger of the gods, but was also the god of rain and wind, and the protector of travelers, shepherds, and thieves. Festivals were held every year in Rome in his honor during the month of May. Atlas, the father of the Pleiades, was a giant who lived in Africa and held up the sky in his shoulders. The great Hercules, when seeking for the golden apples of Hesperides, daughters of Evening Star, came to Atlas to ask him where he could find the apples. Atlas offered to get them for Hercules if he would take his place while he was away. So Hercules took the heavens on his shoulders, and Atlas set off to fetch the golden fruit. But on his return he told Hercules that he must stay where he was, while he himself would take the apples to the king, who had set Hercules the task of finding them. Hercules, as you may imagine, had no wish to spend the rest of his life holding up the sky, and by a trick succeeded in getting Atlas back to his place, and so was able to set out on his homeward journey. The last story of Atlas we read in the account of the great hero Perseus, who, after slaying the Gorgon Medusa, passed Atlas on his way home. Now the face of the Gorgon turned to stone all who looked on it, and Atlas, worn out by the terrible burden he had to bear, persuaded Perseus to show him the Gorgon's head. Eagerly he gazed for a moment on the changeless countenance, but in an instant the straining eyes were stiff and cold, and it seemed to Perseus, as he rose again in the pale yellow air, that the gray hairs which streamed from the giant's head were like the snow which rests upon the peak of a great mountain, and that, in place of the trembling limbs, he saw only the rents and clefts on a rough hillside. Thus, Atlas was changed into the mountains which bear his name and are to be found in the northwest of Africa. Hercules, whom we have mentioned in the story of Atlas, is one of the best known of the Greek heroes, and to this day we often speak of an especially strong man as Hercules, and we also have the expression a Herculean task. Hercules was a son of Jupiter, and devoted his life to riding the country of the fierce beasts which brought death and destruction to many of his people. But through the hatred of the goddess Juno, Hercules knew much sorrow, and underwent great trials. To atone for crimes committed in a fit of madness sent upon him by Juno, he was condemned by the gods to become for a year the slave of the king of Argos, who set him 12 labors. The first of these labors was to slay a lion known as the Nemean lion. In spite of the attempts of many brave men to kill this fierce animal, it still continued to carry off men and women and steal cattle and sheep. Hercules at once set out, and tracking the lion to its den, seized it by the throat and crushed out its life. He then tore off the lion's skin and made it into a covering which he always wore. The second task was also to destroy a monster, a 7-headed serpent known as the Hydra. Hercules attacked the serpent with a sword and cut off one of its heads, but was horrified to see 7 new heads spring from the wound. Thereupon the hero called to his help his friend Iolaus, who seared the wounds with a lighted torch and thus prevented the new heads from growing. In this way, Hercules finally slew the cruel Hydra. Another task set the hero was to capture and tame the horses of the king of Thrace. These horses were fed on human flesh, and the king had ordered all strangers who entered his kingdom to be executed and given as food to the horses. Hercules succeeded in securing these animals and, after throwing the king to his own horses as a punishment for his cruelty, led them to his master, the king of Argos. Of the remaining labors, one was the fetching of the golden apples of Hesperides, which we have mentioned, but the most famous was the cleaning of the Augean stables. King Augeas possessed enormous herds of cattle, and their stables had not been cleaned for many years. Hercules might well have lost heart at the sight of such a task, but he very cleverly overcame the difficulty. Nearby the stables ran a swift river. This Hercules dammed and turned from its course, making it run through the stables, which in time it washed perfectly clean. Then, his task accomplished, Hercules led the river back to its course. After a life of trial and labor, Hercules finally met a tragic death. By a trick, he was persuaded to put on a robe which had been stained with poison. The poison ate into his flesh, and all the hero's attempts to tear off the robe were in vain, so at last he resolved to die. He built an enormous funeral pyre by tearing up oak trees by the roots, and then laid himself on the pyre, to which one of his friends put a torch. In a short time, roaring flames rose up to the sky and consumed the great Hercules, the man of might. The Angles and Saxons seem to have called this month of May Trimilchi, meaning that, owing to the fresh grass of spring, they were able to milk their cows 3 times a day. End of chapter. Chapter 6, June, the month of Juno. The month of June is probably named after Juno, the wife of Jupiter and queen of the gods. It was held sacred to her and was thought by the Romans to be the luckiest month of marriage, since Juno was the goddess of marriage. Wherever the goddess went, she was attended by her messenger Iris, the rainbow, who journeyed so quickly through the air that she was seldom seen, but after she had passed there was often left in the sky the radiant trail of her highly colored robe. Juno is always represented as a tall, beautiful woman, wearing a crown and bearing a scepter in her hand, and often she is shown with a peacock at her side, since that bird was sacred to her. A story is told of one of her servants, Argus, who had 100 eyes, only a few of which he closed at a time. Juno set him to watch over a cow which Jupiter wished to steal, for it was really a beautiful girl named Io, whom Jupiter had transformed. Mercury was sent by Jupiter to carry off Io, and by telling long and wearisome stories to Argus, at last succeeded in lulling him into so deep a sleep that he closed all his eyes. The god then seized Argus's own sword and cut off his head. Juno was very sad at the loss of her servant, and gathering up his 100 eyes, scattered them over the tail of the peacock, her favorite bird. Juno was of a very jealous disposition, and when angered brought all the misfortune she possibly could on the one who had offended her. At a wedding feast at which the gods and goddesses were present, Eris, the goddess of discord, or quarreling, suddenly appeared. She had not been invited because of her evil nature, and in order to have her revenge, she threw on to the table a golden apple bearing the inscription, "To the fairest." A quarrel at once arose as to whom the apple should be given, for it was claimed by Juno, the queen of heaven, Minerva, the goddess of wisdom, and Venus, the goddess of beauty. Being unable to decide among themselves, they determined to appoint as judge a shepherd named Paris, who was really the son of the king of Troy. The 3 goddesses appeared before him on a mountain top, and each in turn tried to persuade him by the promise of a great reward. Minerva offered him wisdom and knowledge. Juno offered him wealth and power, while Venus, quote, drawing nigh, half whispered in his ear, "I promise thee the fairest and most loving wife in Greece." End quote. Paris at once gave the apple to Venus, and thus angered Juno and Minerva, who determined to punish him whenever an opportunity occurred. This they were soon able to do, for Paris, prompted by Venus, carried off Helen, the most beautiful woman in all Greece, and brought her to his own city of Troy. This led to the Trojan War, which we have mentioned. The Trojans, who made their escape from the city, were persecuted by Juno, who brought them into many terrible dangers. Juno, though jealous and unforgiving, gave ungrudging help to those whom she favored. And an example of this is seen in the story of Jason and the Golden Fleece. When Jason was a child, his father Aeson had been driven from his kingdom by his brother Peleus, and Jason, as soon as he reached manhood, determined to avenge his father. Accordingly, he set out for the court of Peleus, and soon came to a stream much swollen by floods. Knowing no fear, he was about to try to ford the stream when he saw an old woman on the bank gazing in despair at the foaming waters. He at once offered to help her by taking her on his back, and in spite of the swift stream and his heavy load, succeeded in getting safely across. He lowered the old woman gently to the ground and was greatly annoyed to find that he had lost one of his sandals in the stream. He turned to bid farewell to the old woman when she was suddenly transformed into the goddess Juno. Jason begged for her help and protection, which Juno at once promised, and the goddess then vanished. Jason then resumed his journey in all haste, and entering his native city, found Peleus in a temple sacrificing to the gods. He pressed forward through the crowd until he stood close to Peleus, who at length caught sight of this stranger, who seemed anxious to speak to him. Fear at once filled his heart, for he remembered that it had been foretold that he would be overthrown by a man who came to him wearing only one sandal. Jason stepped forward and boldly claimed the throne for his father, and Peleus, disguising his fear and anger, invited him to his palace where they could decide the matter. During the banquet which followed, Jason heard the story of Phrixus and Helle, two children who had escaped from their cruel stepmother on a winged ram with a golden fleece, which bore them far away from their home. As they passed over the sea, the girl Helle fell from the ram's back into a part of the sea ever since known as the Hellespont, now the Dardanelles. Phrixus reached Colchis at the eastern end of the Black Sea in safety, and there sacrificed the ram to the gods and hung its golden fleece on a tree which stood in a poisonous wood and was guarded by a serpent. The cunning Peleus dared Jason to try to win the golden fleece, hoping that thus he would be rid of him forever. And Jason, in his excitement, forgot the crime which he had come to avenge, and recklessly promised to bring the fleece to Peleus. With the help of Juno, he gathered together a number of heroes, and this famous band, called the Argonauts from the name of their ship the Argo, set out for Colchis. Arriving there after many adventures, they sought the king and told him of their errand. The king, however, was unwilling to part with the fleece, and said that Jason must first catch 2 wild bulls, which breathed fire and had hoofs of brass, harness them to a plow, and make them plow a field. Then he was to sow the field with serpents' teeth, from which would spring up armed men, whom he must conquer, and finally he was to kill the serpent which guarded the fleece. And Jason did not lose heart when he heard these terrible conditions, but he returned to his ship to think out how he might fulfill them. On his way to the shore, he met the king's daughter, Medea, who possessed magic powers. She had fallen in love with Jason, and she told him how he could perform the task her father had set. The next day, Jason, relying on Medea's help, faced the bulls without fear, seized them by the horns, and, after a great struggle, harnessed them to a plow. As soon as he had plowed the field, he sowed the serpent's teeth. And when the armed men sprang up on all sides, he threw his helmet amongst them. The warriors thought that they had been struck by one of their own number, with the result that they fell upon each other and fought until they all lay dead on the ground. Medea then led Jason to the tree to which the fleece was fastened, and soothing the terrible serpent by her magic, enabled Jason to cut off its head. He quickly snatched the golden fleece from the tree, and with Medea hastened to the shore, whence they set sail in triumph. They wandered far and suffered many misfortunes, but through Juno's help they at last reached their native land. Jason compelled Peleus to give up the kingdom to Aeson, who was now an old man. Medea, however, in some strange way, was able to restore Aeson to his youth and strength, and Peleus' daughters, when they heard of this, asked her how they might do the same for their father. Medea, seeing her opportunity, gave them false instructions, which they followed, only to find that instead of making their father young again, they had killed him. This month of June was called by the Angles and Saxons the dry month, and sometimes the earlier mild month, July being the second mild month. End of chapter. Chapter 7. July, the month of Julius Caesar. This month was first called Quintilis, that is, the 5th month, which shows that the year began with March. In the year 44 BC, the name was changed to Julius in honor of Julius Caesar, the founder of the Roman Empire. The month Quintilis was chosen as the one to be named after the Emperor Julius because his birthday was on the 12th of that month. After his death, the name Caesar became a title of the Roman emperors, and we still have the word in the titles Kaiser of Germany, Tsar or Tsar of Russia, and Kaiser-i-Hind, Emperor of India, one of the titles of our own king. Julius Caesar was a very great soldier, and it was by skill as a general that he became the first emperor the Romans had. Until his time, they had no supreme ruler, the chief office being that of consul. There were 2 consuls who had to be elected and who only served for a certain length of time. The Romans hated the name of king, and Caesar, who seemed to have really wished for the title, was afraid to take it, in case it should turn the people against him. In 44 BC, at the feast of the Lupercalia, held, as we have said, in February, the crown was actually offered to him by Marcus Antonius, a great Roman noble. A quote from Shakespeare's Julius Caesar, quote, "You all did see that on the Lupercal I thrice presented him a kingly crown, which he did thrice refuse." End quote. Caesar made himself master of all Italy, conquered the whole of Gaul, France, and Spain, and won great victories in Greece, Egypt, and Africa. But he is famous not only as a soldier, he was a great statesman, a great orator, and a clever writer and historian. He formed several plans for the improvement of Roman life and took a great interest in the building of public works. He reformed the calendar, as we have seen, and he wished to have the Roman law set out in a clear way so that it could be easily understood. He had plans for draining marshland near Rome in order to make the country more healthy, for enlarging the harbor of Ostia, a very important port near Rome, and for making a canal through the Isthmus of Corinth in Greece. In the year 44 BC, before he could carry out any of these very useful plans, he was killed in Rome by men who had once been his friends, but were now jealous of his power. Shakespeare describes this tragedy in his play Julius Caesar, and makes Marcus Antonius, when looking upon the murdered Caesar, say, quote, "Thou art the ruins of the noblest man that ever lived in the tide of times." End quote. Caesar is particularly interesting to us because he came to our island in the days of the ancient Britons. In one of his books, he tells us that there were great numbers of people, many buildings, and much cattle. There were trees of every kind, as in Gaul, except the beech and the fir. The hare, the hen, and the goose they do not think it right to eat, but they keep them for amusement and pleasure. Most of those living inland do not sow corn, but live on milk and flesh, and are clothed in skins. All stain themselves with woad, which gives a blue color and makes them of more hideous appearance in battle. They have long hair, but shave every part of their body except the head and upper lip. At the time Caesar's invasion, London was a stronghold of the Britons, and was very probably attacked and captured by Caesar. The first mention of London in history is in a book by a Roman historian named Tacitus, who, in describing what happened in the year AD 61, tells us that the Roman general leading the army here in Britain was unable to hold the town at the time of Boadicea's revolt. London was then very largely destroyed, but the Romans rebuilt it and gave it a new name, Augusta, in honor of their Emperor Augustus. This shows that it was a place of great importance even in those early days. The days from 3rd July to 11th August, the hottest part of the year, were called by the Romans dog days, because they thought the great heat was due to Sirius, the dog star. Sirius was a dog belonging to the giant Orion, who was a great hunter. Diana, the goddess of the moon, was also the goddess of hunting, and after she had driven her chariot with its white horses across the starlit sky, she spent the day hunting in the forests. Here she often met Orion, and soon fell in love with him. This angered her brother Apollo, the sun god, who determined to put an end to their friendship. One day, he called Diana to him and began to talk about her skill as an archer. He asked her to shoot at a dark speck which could be seen floating far out at sea. Diana, all unsuspecting, at once drew her bow, and so strong and true was her aim that she hit the object, which disappeared beneath the waves. She then found that the dark speck was the head of Orion, who had been cooling himself in the sea after his hunting. She was filled with grief at his death, and vowing never to forget him, placed him and his dog Sirius in the sky. The constellation Orion can easily be found on a clear night, for the stars forming his belt and sword are unmistakable. Following behind the giant is the very bright star Sirius, the scorching flames of the fierce Orion's hound. Virgil, in his Aeneid, describes one of the heroes of Latium as being as great as Orion, who, walking on foot through the deep waters of the very middle of the sea, making himself a path, yet rises above the billows with his shoulders, or carrying down an ancient ash from the summit of the mountains, has his feet on the earth, his head shrouded by the clouds of heaven. The Anglo-Saxons had two names for this month of July: Hagmonoth, the hay month, and Meadmonoth, the mead month. A third name was sometimes given to it, the latter mild month, that is, the second warm month. End of chapter. Chapter 8. August, the month of Augustus. This month is also named after a great Roman emperor, Augustus Caesar, but was first called Sextilis, the sixth month. Augustus, whose full name was Caius Julius Caesar Octavianus Augustus, the Majestic, being a title given him after he became emperor, was a young man at the time of Caesar's murder. Julius, who had no son of his own, adopted Augustus as his son and heir, in order that when he died, Augustus should become emperor in his place. The nobles who had killed Julius, however, did not wish Augustus to become emperor, and it was not until he had fought and won many battles that he became the head of the Roman Empire. As soon as he had conquered all his enemies, he returned to Rome, and, closing the temple of Janus, proclaimed peace throughout the empire. During his reign, there lived the greatest poets and writers that Rome ever had, of whom the best known are Virgil, Horace, Ovid, and Livy. Just as in the reign of our Queen Elizabeth, there lived some of England's greatest poets and writers. In fact, the time from Spenser and Sidney in Elizabeth's reign, passing beyond Shakespeare to Milton in Charles II's reign, is spoken of as the Augustan Age of English literature. The month known as Sextilis was chosen as the one to be named after Augustus because it was during that month that the most fortunate events of his life had happened. In that month, he had first become consul, the most important man in Rome. He had 3 times entered the city in triumph after his great victories. He had conquered Egypt and had ended the civil wars. As the month had only 30 days and the one named after Julius Caesar had 31, a day was taken from February in order to make them equal. We have more than once mentioned the poet Virgil's most famous work, the Aeneid, in which he describes the wanderings of Aeneas, who gathered together all that was left of the Trojan army and escaped from the fallen city, carrying his father Anchises on his back, since he was old and weak and unable to walk. The fugitives reached the shore in safety and sailed away from their ruined country. But the goddess Juno, not satisfied by the death of Paris and the disaster which had fallen on the Trojans, pursued Aeneas and his followers with her hatred and again brought them into misfortune. They wandered from country to country for many years, seeking a spot where they might settle down in peace and safety, but Juno gave them no rest. She brought sickness upon them so that many died, and sent fierce storms which scattered their feet and destroyed many of their ships. At last they reached a harbor on the coast of Africa and made their way to a city which they found to be Carthage. Aeneas was welcomed by Dido, the queen of the city, who listened eagerly to the story of his adventures. Now Aeneas had been destined by the gods to found a new kingdom, when his wanderings finally came to an end. but the time was not yet. The goddess Venus caused Dido to fall in love with Aeneas, and the hero, happy in her love and the pleasant life of her court, lingered on. A year passed, and the gods at length sent Mercury to remind Aeneas of his destiny. Aeneas' heart sank at the thought of leaving the beautiful Dido, and, afraid of her anger, he secretly set sail one dark night while the queen was sleeping. When Dido discovered her loss, she was filled with grief. She ordered her servants to make a funeral pyre on which was placed an effigy of her lover, and then, setting fire to the pyre with her own hand, she sprang into the flames and perished. Aeneas and his companions sailed on till they reached the island of Sicily, where they took refuge from a storm. During a festival which the men then held in honor of Anchises, Aeneas' father, who had died just a year before, Juno stirred up the women to revolt against their hard life. Tired of their perilous wanderings, they gathered on the shore and set fire to the ships. Aeneas, when he heard of this new disaster, rushed down to the shore and cried to Jupiter for help. In answer to the prayer, the king of the gods sent a storm of rain, which put out the destroying flames. The Trojans then left Sicily, and, coming to Italy, to the mouth of the river Tiber, they followed the river until they reached the county of Latium. Here they were well received by the king, Latinus, who offered to Aeneas the hand of his daughter Lavinia. Lavinia, however, had many suitors, the chief of whom was Turnus, the prince of a neighboring country, and Juno once again interfered by stirring up the people of Latium against Aeneas, with the result that Latinus made war on his former friend. Turnus led the army against the Trojans and performed great deeds of valor, which were only matched by those of Aeneas. While Juno was assisting Turnus in every possible way, Venus was not forgetful of her son Aeneas, and she obtained from Vulcan, the god of fire, a wonderful suit of armor, which enabled Aeneas to do even mightier deeds. Turnus and Aeneas at length met in single combat, and after a fierce encounter, Turnus was killed. Peace was made with Latinus, and Aeneas married Lavinia. He founded a city, which he called Lavinia, and his descendants reigned in Latium for many years. It was one of his race, the Vestal Aelia, who married Mars and became the mother of Romulus and Remus, the founders of Rome. One of the famous passages in the Aeneid is the description of the shield given to Aeneas by the goddess Venus. On this shield, Vulcan, knowing the future, had depicted the history of the descendants of Aeneas and had foretold the glory of Rome. He showed the wolf nursing the two sons of Mars and Ilia, the wars which followed the founding of Rome, and the brave Horatius, who defended the bridge over the Tiber against the army of Tarquin. With wonderful skill, he pictured the sacred geese giving warning to the Romans of the approach of the Gauls in the dead of night. Manlius stood before the temple and kept the lofty capital. A silver goose, flitting through the arches of gold, gave warning with its cries that the Gauls were on the threshold. The Gauls were drawing near through the bushes and were grasping the citadel, protected by the darkened and the favor of a gloomy night. Their hair is golden, and their dress of gold, their cloaks are striped, their milk-white necks are encircled with bands of gold. Each brandishes in his hand 2 alpine javelins, and their bodies are protected by their long shields. In the middle of the shield, Vulcan had depicted the famous sea battle of Actium, in which the Emperor Augustus overthrew his enemies, and finally he showed the emperor seated at the entrance to the temple of Apollo, and receiving the offerings of the conquered nations of the great Roman Empire. The Old English name for August was Loaf Mas, that is, loaf mass or loaf feast, because during the month was held a feast of thanksgiving for the first fruits of the corn, August being the time when harvesting begins. The first day is sometimes called Lammas Day, Lammas being a slightly altered form of the word Loaf Mas. End of chapter. Chapter 9. September, the 7th month. The name of this month means simply seventh, and so suggests to us neither god nor hero. We find, however, that there were several festivals held in the month, and not the least important of these was one held on the second of the month and known as the Actian Games. On this day, in the year 31 BC, was fought the great sea battle of Actium in Greece, in which Augustus defeated by Marcus Antonius and the Egyptian queen Cleopatra. On the promontory of Actium stood a temple to Apollo, and from that time onward, games in honor of Apollo were held on each anniversary of the victory. It was a common custom among the Greeks and Romans to hold games or sports in honor of a god, and the most famous of all, the Olympic Games, were held every 4 years in Greece in honor of Zeus, the Roman Jupiter. These games lasted for 5 days and consisted of foot races, chariot races, wrestling, boxing, throwing the quoit, and the javelin. The first prize was usually a wreath made from the laurel tree, the favorite tree of Apollo. A story says that Apollo fell in love with Daphne, a beautiful wood nymph and daughter of a river god. Daphne, however, did not return Apollo's love, and on one occasion ran away from him. The sun god pursued her, calling to her that he meant no harm, but just as he was within reach of her, she prayed to her father for help. She at once became rooted to the ground, and found that her limbs were rapidly changing into branches and her hair into leaves. When Apollo stretched out his hands to catch her, he found nothing in his grasp but the trunk of a tree. The river god had changed his daughter into a laurel. From that time onward, Apollo took the laurel for his favorite tree, and said that prizes given to poets and musicians, for Apollo was also god of music and poetry, should be wreaths made from the leaves of that tree. Thus, the laurel wreath came to be more eagerly sought after than gold or silver. The Olympic Games, which we have mentioned, are the origin of the Olympic Games which have been held in Europe and America every 4th year for some years past. They are held at the capital of each of the great countries in turn, and they were held in London at the Shepherd's Bush exhibition in 1908. The chief event is the marathon race, which in 1908 was run from Windsor to the stadium at the exhibition, a distance of 25 miles. This race has its origin in an historical event of the year 490 BC. In that year was fought the great battle of Marathon between the Greeks and the invading Persians. In spite of the far greater numbers of the Persian army, the Greeks won a glorious victory. Now, in the ranks of the Greek army was a famous runner named Phidippides, who had won many a prize in the games. When the Persians had been put to flight, the Greek general sent for Phidippides and bade him run with the news of the victory to Athens, the capital of Greece, distant nearly 25 miles, where all those unable to fight were awaiting anxiously the result of the battle. Phidippides, although tired by his share in the battle, at once set off on his long journey. In time, the strain of the task began to tell upon him, and it was only by a great effort that he was able to continue his course. At last, with aching limbs and faltering step, he came in sight of the city. The Athenians, seeing him in the distance, ran eagerly to meet him, falling into the arms of the foremost of them. The runner, with his last breath, gasped, "Rejoice, we conquer!" Even as the joyful words left his lips, Phidippides sank lifeless in the arms that held him, and his brave spirit went forth on its last journey to meet the heroes of the past. And from Robert Browning, Phidippides, quote, "So, when Persia was dust, all cried, 'To Acropolis, run, Phidippides, one race more, the meed is thy due. Athens is saved, thank Pan, go shout!' He flung down his shield, ran like the fire once more, and the space twixt the fennel field, and Athens was stubble again, a field which a fire runs through, till in he broke, 'Rejoice, we conquer!' Like wine through clay, joy in his blood bursting his heart, he died. The bliss." End quote. Famous among the very old stories of the Greeks is that of the swift-footed Atalanta, the daughter of the king of Arcadia. And this king had longed for a son who might succeed him, and on the birth of Atalanta was filled with anger and disappointment. He ordered her to be taken away while she was still a baby and left on a mountaintop at the mercy of the wild beasts. Here she was found by some hunters who took pity on her and carried her to their home. As she grew up, they taught her to hunt, and in time she became more skilled in running and in the chase than they all. She took part with some of the great heroes in a famous hunt for a wild boar, which she finally helped kill. Her father, hearing of her skill, welcomed her back, and since he still had no son, urged her to marry one of the many suitors who came to the court. Atalanta, however, had no desire to marry, and knowing that she could run more swiftly than any of those who sought her hand in marriage, she declared that she would only marry the man who could outrun her. She also decreed that everyone who failed to win should pay for his defeat with his life. In spite of these cruel conditions, many eager youths tried to win her, but she outran them all, and their heads were exposed on the racecourse in order to frighten others who might wish to marry her. At last there came to the court of the king of Arcadia a young man named Milanion, who was determined to win Atalanta for his wife. He had previously sought the help and protection of Venus, and in answer to his prayer, the goddess had given him 3 golden apples. The proud Atalanta accepted Melanion's challenge, and once again the course was thronged with people eager to see the daring youth. The signal was given, and the runners darted forward. Atalanta soon passed Milanion, who then threw at her feet one of his golden apples. She paused a moment, tempted by the glittering object, then stooping, she quickly snatched it up and raced after Milanion, who was by this time ahead of her. She soon overtook him, when he threw down a second golden apple, and again she stopped to pick it up. A third time the swift maiden passed the youth, once more to be tempted by the golden fruit. Sure of her skill, she paused to seize the third golden apple, but before she could overtake Milanion, he had reached the goal. Atalanta, bound by her promise, consented to marry the victorious Milanion, and their wedding was celebrated amid great rejoicing. The old English name for September was Gersmonoth, which means barley month, since during September the barley crop was usually harvested. End of chapter. Chapter 10. October, the 8th month. In this, the 8th month, we held a great festival at Eleusis, a town 12 miles from Athens, in honor of the Greek goddess Demeter. The Roman name for Demeter was Ceres, and she was worshipped as the goddess of agriculture, since the fields and their crops were thought to be under her special care. The Greek name Demeter means Earth Mother, and the name Ceres has given us the word cereals, a general name for wheat, barley, rye, and oats. Ceres had a daughter, Persephone, who spent a great part of her time wandering with her companions on the slopes and plains of Sicily. One day, as Persephone and her maidens were plucking flowers and weaving them into garlands, Pluto, the god of the underworld, rode by in his dark chariot, drawn by 4 black horses. Attracted by Persephone's beauty, he determined to carry her off and make her his queen. One story says that he caused a most wonderful flower to spring up, and Persephone, seeing it in the distance and wishing to gather it, was thus separated from her companions. As she stooped to pluck the flower, the earth opened, and Pluto, in his chariot, came up from underworld, and seizing the Persephone, carried her down to his dark and gloomy home. Another story says that as soon as he saw Persephone, he walked quickly towards her, and before she could guess his intention, caught her up and carrying her in spite of her struggles to his chariot, drove away at topmost speed. He at length reached a river whose roaring torrent it was impossible to cross. Afraid to turn back lest he should meet Ceres, he struck the earth such a blow with the 2-pronged fork, which he always carried as the emblem of his power, that the ground opened beneath him, and thus he was able to reach his dark kingdom of Hades in safety. This Hades, the underworld to which Pluto had brought Persephone, was the home of the dead, the place to which came the spirits of those who had died, there to receive a fitting reward for their deeds on earth. From Pluto's throne flowed 5 rivers. One, Styx, the hateful, a sacred river, and one by which the gods feared to swear and not keep their oath. It was also the river which had to be crossed by the spirits before they could reach the throne. They were ferried across by an old boatman named Charon, who charged them an obol, about 1.5 of our money. It was the custom, when a man died, for his relations to put an obol under his tongue, so that he might have no difficulty in crossing the Styx. Those who came without their obol had to wait 100 years, after which time Charon would take them across free of charge. 2. Acheron, pain, a dark and very deep river that also had to be crossed by the spirits. 3. Lethe, forgetfulness, which had the power of making all those who drank of its waters forget the past. 4. Phlegethon, blazing, a river of fire which surrounded Tartarus, that part of the underworld to which were sent the spirits of evildoers, in order that they might suffer punishment for their wicked deeds. 5. Cocytus, wailing, a river of salt water, the tears of those condemned to the torments of Tartarus. In a distant part of Hades, far removed from the place of torment, were the Elysian fields. Here dwelt the great and the good, in perpetual day and amid the ever-blooming flowers of an eternal spring. While the frightened Persephone was thus, against her will, made queen of this sunless kingdom of the dead, Ceres, with many tears, was seeking her daughter in the flower-strewn meadows, but all in vain. After many wanderings in Italy, and even in Greece, where she visited the city of Eleusis, mentioned above, Ceres at last learnt of Persephone's fate. But her joy at finding that she was safe was turned to grief by the thought that Pluto would never allow her to come back to the happiness of the sunlit earth. Meanwhile, the goddess had neglected all her duties. The flowers withered away, the trees shed their leaves, the fruit was falling from the branches, and the crops could not ripen. The time of harvest was quickly passing, and the people, threatened with famine, and finding that their prayers to the goddess were unheeded, appealed to Jupiter to save them from starvation and death by allowing Persephone to return to the upper world. Jupiter at last consented and said that Pluto must give up Persephone, provided that she had not eaten anything since the time when she had been carried off. Unfortunately, that very day she had tasted a pomegranate, which Pluto had given her, and she was compelled to stay with her husband 1 month for each of the 6 seeds she had eaten. So for 6 months she has to live in the underworld, and therein the thick gloom, never pierced by a ray of sunshine, she waits for the time when she may return to the sun-kissed hills and plains of her favorite land, where, happy in her mother's smile, she dances with her companions amid the flowers. Quote, Persephone to Ceres has returned from that dark god who stole her for his bride, and bids the earth, that for her coming yearned, its somber garb of mourning lay aside. The sun o'ertops the clouds with wonted speed, and so to give the goddess honor due, o'er hill and dale, o'er mountain side and mead, now scatters flowers of many a wondrous hue. The trees that shed their leaves, each leaf a tear, now deck themselves again in bright array, and man delights to see the winter drear yield place to spring, and night to gladsome day. At length comes the time when once more Persephone must return to her desolate home, and with heavy heart she leaves the sorrowing Ceres. Persephone is called away, and Ceres weeps that she must go, while o'er the earth now slowly creeps the gloom of death. Fled is that smile of love that made all nature waken into life, and all things fade. The Old English name for October was Winterfylleth, which is winter full moon, because winter was supposed to begin at the October full moon. End of chapter. Chapter 11. November, the 9th month. On the 13th of this 9th month, the Romans held a feast in honor of Jupiter, the ruler of gods and men. From the clouded top of Mount Olympus, he held sway over the whole world, and even the gods had to bow to his supreme will. Terrible indeed was it to anger any of the gods, but no punishment was more swift and sure than that sent by Jupiter when he was enraged. We have seen how, with his thunderbolt, he slew the proud and reckless Phaeton. And we have another example in the story of Bellerophon. This hero, who was staying at the court of Grecian king, was set the task of killing the Chimera, a terrible monster with a lion's head, a goat's body, a dragon's tail, and breath of fire. While sorrowfully wondering how he could possibly perform so difficult a task, Bellerophon suddenly found before him the goddess Minerva, who asked him the cause of his trouble. As soon as she had learnt of his task, she promised to help him, and, giving him a golden bridle, told to bridle the horse Pegasus. Now Pegasus was a winged horse which the sea god Neptune had made from the drops of blood that fell into the sea from the head of the Gorgon Medusa, slain by Perseus. He was perfectly white and of great speed, and, as Bellerophon well knew, came down to earth to drink at a certain spring. Bellerophon waited in hiding by this spring, and taking Pegasus by surprise, jumped upon his back. The winged horse at once flew up to a great height, trying to unseat Bellerophon, but the hero succeeded in putting on Minerva's golden bridle, when Pegasus at once became gentle. Bellerophon then set off on his task, and suddenly swooping down from the sky upon the Chimera, overcame and killed the dreadful monster. His task accomplished, he might now have lived in happiness, but he became filled with pride because of the wonderful flights he had made on Pegasus. One day, as he soared up higher and higher, he began to think himself equal to the gods, and wished to join them on Mount Olympus. This angered Jupiter, who sent a gadfly which stung Pegasus. Suddenly rearing up, the winged horse threw the proud Bellerophon far down to the earth beneath. The goddess, Minerva, who appeared to Bellerophon, was a daughter of Jupiter, but she was born in a very strange way, for she sprang out of her father's head, clothed in bright armor and with a spear in her hand. She became the goddess of wisdom, as we have seen in the story of Paris, of the arts and the sciences, and of spinning and weaving. Her skill in weaving is shown by the following story. There once lived in Greece a girl named Arachne, who was so clever at needlework that at last, in her pride, she boasted that she could weave more skillfully than Minerva herself. Minerva, angered by these words, one day came down to Arachne's home and accepted the challenge which she had so rashly made. The story is thus told by the poet Spenser in The Fate of the Butterfly. Quote, Minerva did the challenge not refuse, but deigned with her the paragon to make. So to their work they sit, and each doth choose what story she will for her tappet take. End quote. Footnote, tappet to mean tapestry. Arachne pictured the story of Jupiter when, disguised as a white bull, he carried off Europa to the land which afterwards bore the name Europe. Minerva chose for her work the story of her own contest with the sea god Neptune as to which of them should have the honor of naming a new city that had been built in Greece. And Jupiter had said that the honor would be given to the one who gave the most useful gift to man, and he called all the gods together to judge the contest. Neptune struck the ground with his trident, and there sprang forth a horse. The gods were filled with wonder at the sight of the noble animal, and when Neptune explained how useful it would be to man, they all thought that the victory would be his. Minerva then produced an olive tree. At this, all the gods laughed with scorn, but when the goddess, heedless of their laughter, had explained how all its parts, the wood, the fruit, and the leaves, could be used by man, how it was the sign of peace while the horse was the symbol of war, they decided that Minerva had won. And since her name among the Greeks was Athene, she gave to the city the name of Athens. All this the goddess wove in her tapestry. Quote, Then sets she forth, how with her weapon dread she smote the ground, the which straight forth did yield a fruitful olive tree, with berries spread, that all the gods admired. Then all the story she compassed with a wreath of olives hoary. Amongst the leaves she made a butterfly, with excellent device and wondrous light, fluttering among the olives wantonly, that seemed to live so like it was in sight, the velvet nap which on his wings doth lie, the silken down with which his back is dight, his broad outstretched horns, his hairy thighs, his glorious colors, and his glistering eyes, which when Arachne saw, as overlaid and mastered with workmanship so rare, she stood astonied, long nor aught gainsaid, and with fast fixed eyes on her did stare, and by her silence, sign of one dismayed, the victory did yield her as her share. Then in anger and despair, the unhappy girl hanged herself, and Minerva turned her dangling body into a spider, and bade her for ever spin and weave. The Angles and Saxons had two names for this month of November: Windmonoth, that is, wind month, and Bloodmonoth, that is, blood month. The latter name arose from the fact that during this month they slaughtered large numbers of cattle to last them through the cold and dreary winter. End of chapter. Chapter 12. December, the 10th month. The chief festival of this 10th and last month of the Roman year was the Saturnalia, held on the 17th of the month in honor of Saturn, the father of Jupiter. Saturn, or Kronos, as the Greeks called him, was one of the Titans, the 6 giant sons of Uranus, heaven, and Gaia, earth. Uranus ruled before the days of man, but he was overthrown by his son Saturn, who became for a time the supreme ruler of the universe. Uranus, however, prophesied that Saturn would one day himself be overthrown by his children, and in order to avoid this, Saturn, when his first child was born, immediately swallowed him. As other children were born, he swallowed each of them, until at last Rhea, his wife, succeeded in hiding her youngest son, Jupiter, and deceived Saturn by giving him a stone wrapped in swaddling clothes, which in his haste he swallowed without realizing the trick played upon him. Jupiter was thus saved, and when he grew up, he overthrew his father, as Uranus had foretold. Saturn, having lost his power, took refuge on the earth and became king of a part of Italy, which, as Virgil tells us in the 8th book of the Aeneid, he called Latium, since it was there that he lay hid. Latin, lateo, means to lie hidden. Saturn was the first to come from heavenly Olympus, fleeing the arms of Jupiter, an exile deprived of his kingdom. He it was who made into a nation people untaught and scattered onto the mountain tops, and gave them laws, and chose that the land should be called Latium, because in safety he had lain hidden in this region. Jupiter's rule was very soon threatened by the Titans, who refused to bow to his will, but after a long and terrible struggle, the giants were overthrown by Jupiter's thunderbolts. One of the giants was imprisoned under Mount Aetna, where, breathing out fire and smoke, he still struggles to free himself, thus causing earthquakes and volcanic eruptions. Another of the Titans, Epeius, had 2 sons, Prometheus, forethought, and Epimetheus, afterthought. To these 2 gods fell the task of making man, who was to rule over all living creatures. Prometheus was very anxious to give to the race of men that he had fashioned a power that would make them supreme on the earth, and nearer to the gods themselves. The way in which he could best bestow this power upon them was by the gift of fire, for fire belonged only to the gods and was jealously guarded by them. In spite of the terrible punishment which he knew awaited him should he be discovered, Prometheus determined to steal fire from heaven, and during one dark night he brought down to the earth a burning stick from the home of the gods on Mount Olympus. Jupiter, seeing an unaccustomed light on earth, discovered the theft, and his rage knew no bounds. He seized Prometheus, carried him off to the Caucasus Mountains, and there bound him with chains to a huge rock. Then he sent a vulture that, day after day, might feed upon his liver, which grew again during the night, so that the terrible torture of the gods should have no end. After hundreds of years of this ghastly pain and suffering, Prometheus was rescued by Hercules, who came to ask him where he might find the golden apples of the Hesperides. Hercules killed the vulture, broke Prometheus' chains, and released the tortured god, who in turn advised Hercules to go to the giant Atlas, who knew where the apples were, as we have seen in the story of Atlas's daughter Maya. Prometheus' brother, Epimetheus, married the beautiful Pandora, and at first lived with her in great happiness, for in those early days the earth was free from pain, sickness, and ills of every kind. One evening they saw Mercury, the messenger of the gods, coming towards them and bearing on his shoulder a huge box which seemed to be of great weight. Tired out with his burden, Mercury begged permission to leave the box to their care, promising to return for it in a short time. Pandora and Epimetheus readily granted permission, and Mercury placed the box in their house and hastily departed. Pandora was at once filled with great curiosity as to what the box might contain, and suggested to Epimetheus that they should just peep inside. Epimetheus was shocked by Pandora's lack of good manners, and, replying that they must not think of such a thing, he went out, calling to Pandora to follow him. But Pandora's curiosity was now thoroughly aroused, and the temptation overcame her when she found herself alone. Quickly, she undid the cord which bound the box, and, thinking she heard sounds in the box, she put her ear close to the lid. To her surprise, she heard voices calling, "Let us out! Let us out!" Pandora, filled with excitement, slowly raised the lid a little just for a peep, as she said to herself. But no sooner was the box opened than out flew little winged creatures, some of which settled on Pandora and Epimetheus, who had now returned, and stung them so that they knew pain for the first time. Then, escaping into the world, these insects, evil, sickness, unhappiness, and all the little troubles of life, became a cause of endless pain and suffering to men and women. Poor Pandora was broken-hearted, and her eyes filled with tears at the thought of the harm she had done. Then again she was startled to hear a voice still calling from the box. It sounded so kind and gentle, and pleaded so sweetly to be let out, that Pandora raised the lid a second time, and out flew Hope, who had been shut in with the cruel insects, and now fluttered busily over the earth, healing the wounds made by her evil companions. This cheery little creature, Hope, may well be associated with the winter month December, when Ceres and her trees and flowers mourn for the smiling Persephone, yet cling to the hope of her return. It is Hope who bids us say with the poet, "If winter comes, can spring be far behind?" On December 25th, the Romans held a festival of the winter solstice, the turning point of winter, when the days begin to grow longer. It was called Dies Natalis Solis Invicti, the birthday of the unconquered sun, and it is very probable that for this reason the Christians chose the 25th of December for the birthday of Christ. In early times, Christmas, the Mass or Feast of Christ, was kept at different times in the year, but it was finally fixed on December 25th, since on that day there was already held this heathen festival to the sun, which had a meaning in some way similar to that of our Christmas. It was an easy thing to make the birthday of the unconquered sun, which wakes all nature from its winter sleep, into the birthday of the unconquered Son of God, who brought new life and hope to the world. The same thing took place among the northern races of Europe and in our own islands. The first Christian missionaries found that at the time of year we now call Christmas, the northern men kept a festival called Yule, the greatest feast in the year. Yule means wheel, and the festival was so named because the sun was thought to be like a wheel revolving swiftly across the sky. It used at one time to be a custom in England and Germany for the people to gather each year on a hilltop to set fire to a huge wooden wheel bound with straw and to send it rolling down the hill. The Christians made this festival into a Christian festival, and we still speak of Christmas as Yuletide. The origin of Santa Claus is Saint Nicholas, who was the patron saint of Russia. He was famous for his kindness and generosity, and a festival was held in his honor on the 6th of December. The custom of giving Christmas boxes comes from the Romans, and in later days, these gifts came to be called boxes, because at Christmas time, boxes were hung up in the churches in which people might put money for the poor. On the day after Christmas Day, these boxes were opened, and the day was thus known as Boxing Day. Another custom, which comes from the Romans, is that of having a Christmas tree hung with toys, a custom which dates back to the Saturnalia. Virgil, in his book called the Georgics, describes how the farmers, when holding a festival in honor of Bacchus, god of wine, hang from the tall pine tiny waving mask of the god. December also had two names among the Angles and Saxons, Wintermonath and Heligmonath, that is, holy month, from the fact that Christmas falls in this month. End of chapter. I'll meet you at the next video, where we're going to now go through the stories of the days. Please do make sure to hit like, share, and subscribe, and I am looking forward to reading your comments.